The aircraft took off before the heat came up, in a formation of 16, and turned north. They met a tanker over the mountains at a point they had used before. They crossed into the country at a place they had crossed the week before. They were over the ground that mattered for about 20 minutes, and then they turned and came out the way they had gone in, and met the tanker again, and landed on the same strip of concrete they had left. The next day the same thing happened. It happened the day after that, and in the week that followed, and in the year that followed the week, and it kept happening for the better part of 4 years. Nothing about the route into North Vietnam was secret. The men who flew it knew that the ground below them knew it too. The map of the North had been cut into numbered boxes, and every box had an owner, and the owners took turns. The weather closed the whole thing down for months at a stretch, and then opened it again, and the schedule went back to what it had been. What changed was not the work. What changed was the sky the work was done in. In the spring of 1965, there was almost nothing above that country but guns. By the end there were guns, and missiles, and fighters brought up from the ground at the right moment, and all three of them tied into one another. This is the story of a campaign that was designed as pressure and lived as a timetable. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this, and nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered. We are going to start where the cruise had to start, with the country itself, the coast, the high ground behind it, and the weather that decided what could be done and when. North of Saigon, the coast runs 700 miles, almost to China, and for most of that distance the country is a narrow strip of flat ground with the sea on one side and steep hills on the other. There is not much room in it. The road runs along the strip, the railway beside the road, and both stay in sight of the water for hundreds of miles at a stretch. Then the hills open and the land widens. The Red River comes down out of the northwest and lays out a second delta, smaller and poorer than the great one in the south. Hanoi stands on that delta. Haiphong, the main port of the north, stands where the water reaches the sea. Almost everything that mattered in the air war of those years lay on that ground or within sight of it. People have farmed the delta for perhaps 4,000 years, and they built it up as they farmed it, a web of dikes and canals, holding the water where the rice needed it. From there, families moved south along the coast for centuries, river by river. West of the coastal strip, the ground stands up. The Annamite chain runs the length of the country from north to south, pressed against the Laotian border on one side, coming down to the sea on the other. Its forested ridges and limestone towers reach 8,500 feet in places. For an aircraft working low in poor visibility, the high ground was a hazard in itself. Forest covered about 60% of the country, and the canopy stood 200 feet and more above the floor of it. Limestone ran through much of the rest, karst, good to hide under and bad to fly among. Some karst valleys are too narrow for a large aircraft to turn around in. That chain divides more than 2 countries. It divides weather. When the cloud of the northeast monsoon sits over the north, the sky over the panhandle to the west is often open, and 2 halves of the same working day, an hour apart, could look nothing like each other. Northwest of Hanoi, one ridge runs out of the mountains toward the city, about 4,000 feet high, coming within 30 miles of the center. Aircraft arriving from the west could run along it with the high ground between themselves and the radars. Crews called it Thud Ridge, after the nickname of the aircraft most of them were flying, and the name stayed on the map, so nearly everything worth striking lay close to the water. Most of the targets, and nearly all the routes that fed them, stood within 25 or 30 miles of the Gulf of Tonkin, and most of what lay below the 20th parallel sat on the coast road or in one of the small ports along it. That is why the carriers could work the country without taking fuel in the air. In the northeast corner, the targets crowd together. A rail yard and 2 bridges could stand within a few miles of one another, and at the speed a fighter crossed that ground, the difference between them stopped meaning much. The risk over them was the same. 30 miles further out, the defenses thinned, and the important targets ran out. From autumn to spring, the northeast monsoon closed the north of the country for about half of every year. Through all of it, the Red River Delta lay under low cloud. The monsoon is the dry half of the year, which is true and beside the point. The cloud almost never broke into rain. It hung there and it did not tear. In the autumn of 1966, it came early. By the middle of October, the overcast over Hanoi and Haiphong was solid and often below 1,000 feet, and it stayed that way for 6 months. What was new was weather that did not move on over the one part of the country where the work was. Through the monsoon, a crew working the Hanoi area could count on 4 to 6 days in a month when the target could be seen with the eyes. That was the whole margin. Seeing the target did not mean recognizing a rail yard from the air. It meant seeing the particular part of that yard which had been assigned, in conditions that were marginal at best. Between those days there were cracks, short breaks in the overcast, wide enough for one target and closing again behind. The other half of the year was no gift either. The southwest monsoon brought showers and thunderstorms that could put visibility on the ground in minutes. The worst of it came at night and in the early morning, the hours when traffic on the northern roads moved. When the delta was shut, the work went somewhere else. At the height of the northeast monsoon, more than half of a month's fighter sorties over the north and Laos went into the Laotian Panhandle, and the share reaching the Red River Delta fell far below 1/20th of the total. Even in the good season, the Delta never took more than 1/5. On the 10th of December 1965, the country was cut up on paper. The cut ran crosswise, in bands running north from the demilitarized zone, and each band became one command's responsibility. They were called route packages. There were 7 of them, 5 bands running north from the zone, and beyond those a 6th, the northernmost of all, divided into 2. The order that fixed the arrangement came from the Pacific Command on the 1st of April 1966, and it held to the end. The band directly above the demilitarized zone went to the headquarters in Saigon and was worked as a continuation of the ground war. 4 coastal packages went to the Navy, which suited the carriers. Their aircraft reached that ground without refueling. Everything to the north and west went to the Pacific Air Forces, which in practice meant the wings sitting in Thailand. The 6th package, over the northeast, was the one that counted. Most of the worthwhile targets in the country were inside it, and so was the heaviest concentration of defenses anywhere in the war. They split that package along the Northeast Railway. The line was chosen because it was a line, a thing a man could see from the cockpit and know at once which side he was on, so that pilots of 2 services would not take one another for strangers. The boundary between two air forces was drawn along the one landmark that could be read from above. By the summer of 1966, aircraft could hunt for traffic anywhere in the country, except in three places: a strip along the Chinese border, a circle around the port of Haiphong, and a circle around Hanoi. Inside the Hanoi circle, certain stretches of road were open anyway, one of them within 12 miles of the center. One clause of that order dealt with the weather. When the weather required it, either commander sent his aircraft into the other man's area. The map was drawn once and stood for the rest of the campaign. The sky above it was drawn again every morning, and it never used the same lines twice. Most of the weight of the campaign was carried by one aircraft, a single-engine, single-seat fighter bomber, the Thunder Chief. It had been built in the late 1950s for a different war. A fast run at low level with one small nuclear weapon carried inside the fuselage. Over the north, it carried ordinary bombs, hung outside on the wing, and it was not especially well suited to the work. Its wing was small, because a small wing serves down low at high speed. Up high, the same wing left very little room to maneuver. What the aircraft could do, it did better than anything else the Air Force had in 1966. Carry more bombs, further, and outrun enemy fighters at low altitude. What it could not do was turn with them. Crews were not sentimental about it. They called it the lead sled, and more often the thud, and in the war the second name turned into something closer to affection. A loaded aircraft took 6 bombs under the fuselage and a pair more on the outer pylons. With 7,500 pounds hung on it, it was ungainly in the air. At the start of the campaign, the Air Force had about 600 Thunder Chiefs and about 600 Phantoms. The difference between the two figures was that only one of them could still grow. The Thunder Chief line was already shut. Phantoms were still coming off the factory floor and would keep coming for years. So the aircraft that could not be replaced was the one held for the most dangerous work, while the growing fleet of two-seaters took more of the less exposed flying in the South. There was a second reason stated plainly at the time. A single-seat aircraft cost at most one man. By the end of the campaign, more than half of the Thunder Chiefs were gone. The Phantom was the newer machine, 2 engines, 2 seats, descended from a naval fighter of the late 1940s. It climbed better and turned better, and it paid for both in fuel and in range. It also smoked. In daylight, it drew a black trail that told anyone watching where it was, and only the afterburner cleared it. Night work fell mainly to it. 2 men in a cockpit handled the dark better than 1 man alone. The early Phantom had no gun at all. The Navy had built it to defend a task force with radar-guided missiles, killing at over a mile while the radar held its lock. Over North Vietnam, that worked badly. Returns off the ground spoiled the guidance, and the standing requirement to identify a target by eye brought the aircraft closer than its own missile could be used. Heat-seeking missiles took a target from behind, by the exhaust, and even those brought crews in very close. A gun in a pod under the fuselage arrived in 1967. Aircraft with a gun built into the nose reached Southeast Asia only at the very end of the campaign in 1968. The second seat existed because of the radar. Someone had to hold the target while the man in front fired. The Navy put a navigator in it. The Air Force put a second pilot, and in the end, came round to the Navy's arrangement. Nobody wanted to fly in back. Neither aircraft began the campaign with self-sealing tanks, and in both the hydraulic lines and their backup ran close enough together that one hit could take the controls away, open the tank. Sealed tanks are heavier, and both machines were heavy already. Some Thunder Chiefs got tanks and separated lines later. The Phantom kept the light ones and kept its maneuver. Off the carriers, the work went mostly to a smaller aircraft. The Skyhawk was light, single-engined, and cost about a third of what the big Air Force machines cost. It carried less than any of them, and it flew most of the early strikes from the decks. A fighter called the Crusader flew alongside it as escort. One naval aircraft had no equal in the theater. The Intruder was subsonic, and it carried a radar that let it follow the shape of the ground in the dark. It was the most effective bad-weather bomber in Southeast Asia, and at night its accuracy was in a different class from a Thunder Chief's. Its electronics needed constant attention, and their number could not be raised quickly. Older than any of them was the Sky Raider, a piston aircraft left from the previous war. 4 cannon, heavy armor, 7,000 pounds of bombs, and the patience to stay over one point for a long time. It was slow, and that ruled it out of most of the flying over the north. In the first year, most of the fighter pilots arrived with several years of fighter flying behind them somewhere else. As the war went on, the training units at home sent a growing share of men new to fighters, and of men who had crossed over from bombers and transports. Once a year, on the anniversary of a squadron's arrival, much of its personnel left at once, and the replacements arrived with no experience of the theater. For most of 1965, there was no counter of any kind. Squadrons flew in from Japan and the United States for 120 days of temporary duty, and then flew out. In the summer, the arrangement was changed. Units would be assigned permanently for a year. And from November, the squadrons in Southeast Asia counted as permanent. The tour itself was set in November 1965 by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. A pilot flew 100 missions over the North, or 1 year, whichever came first, and then he went home. It was not a new idea. Men had gone home the same way after 100 missions over North Korea. Only missions over the North counted. 100 usually took 7 or 8 months, and how long depended on the seasons, on the number of days the weather allowed work up there. From that winter on, a fighter pilot service was measured in returns rather than in months. Everyone else on the base still went by the calendar. The rule cost something. Losses ran higher than expected. Men were leaving on the counter, and through 1966 the demand for pilots stayed ahead of the supply. Training courses were shortened. 4 wings at home were held as a pool of replacements, the first of them available in May 1966, and tours in Europe were cut short to free men for the war. A second tour was voluntary, and most did not take one. They had used their luck once and preferred not to test it again. The exception sat in the back seat. Men who had flown a tour behind another pilot came back for a second one to reach the front. The Navy counted nothing of the kind. Its people came back to the same water, deployment after deployment, and the length of a man's war was the length of his ships. So there were 2 clocks running. One was a calendar, and it moved whether anybody flew or not. The other moved only when an aircraft came back over the fence, taxied in and shut down, and it moved by 1. Yankee Station was not a place. It was a point of open water in the Gulf of Tonkin, fixed in the spring of 1964, when a carrier group was told it could work as it liked, so long as it stayed within 2 days steaming of that point. The name came almost at once. In 1966, the point was moved north, closer to the country the aircraft were flying against. There was a second station, and it was not in the Gulf at all. It lay far to the south, off the coast of South Vietnam, and what flew from it flew over the war in the south, a different sea and different work. It opened in the spring of 1965 and closed in August of 1966. While it existed, there were fewer ships in the north. How many carriers stood on the northern station depended on the year. In the first half of 1965, 2 of 3 were there. After the southern station closed, all 3 worked the north. Through 1967, it was usually 1 or 2. 3 at once was the ceiling of these years, and it was reached rarely. A large carrier held something over 100 aircraft, and a small one about 70, and 4 out of every 5 were strike aircraft. Up to 5,000 men lived in the hull beneath them. It was an airfield the size of a yard. Everything an airfield does, launch, recover, arm, fuel, feed, repair, sleep, had to happen in that yard, in that order, with nobody standing in anybody else's work. What the ships were good for was written down plainly at the time. They deployed fast and needed nothing built for them. A carrier arrived and was at full work on arrival. It could move up and down the coast. Nothing on land reached it. It carried its own supply line, which competed with nobody. And all of that, the same account adds, was largely paid back in what it was like to live and work aboard. Governing everything was the recovery window. Whatever had been launched had to be back on deck within 20 to 30 minutes of the next wave going off the bow. Not because anybody preferred it that way, because the deck could not do 2 things at once. That window set the length of the flight, the weight under the wings, and the fuel in the tanks, for every aircraft alike. Weight was the reason. A fighter working from a runway ashore could come home with its missiles and its bombs, still on the racks and fuel to spare, and put all of that down on 7,000 feet of concrete. The same load could not be put down on 1,600 feet of deck with more than a third of that fuel aboard. So the aircraft went out light. Partial tanks, partial load, less reach, less weight delivered. Cycles were built around whichever aircraft the ship had most of, usually the Skyhawk. Everything else had to fit that. Machines faster than the cycle wanted flew slower than they could, throttled back over the water, so that a launch of mixed types came back as one group and could be taken aboard inside the same window. A small carrier had 2 catapults and a large one 4, and each had a weight it would not exceed. That limit reached back down the line and decided what could be hung under a wing at all. Catapults also failed, and failed often. One catapult out could double the time it took to put a strike into the air, and the aircraft already upweighted. None of this took any account of the sea. In the 10 days that ran from just before Christmas of 1965 into the new year, one carrier struck 295 sorties off her schedule because the deck was moving too much to fly from. High water also pushed back replenishment, which took the flying down again days later. Of the aircraft aboard, the Crusaders suffered the motion worst. Aircraft in the air were not free of the deck either. One morning in February of 1965, a launched group was held circling above its own ship for half an hour, while the strike was sorted out with other forces below it. When a second delay was asked for, it was refused. Half an hour was what the ship had to give, and it had already given it. Some of what flew never went near the coast. Fighter patrols stood between the shore and the ships, covering the force itself, and their relief had to be launched and in position between the morning strike and the afternoon one. That relief came off the same deck, out of the same window, and it was counted against the same day's flying as everything else. The ships also held the only eyes that far north. A radar picket lay in the Gulf under a call sign of its own, watching the coastal belt. Between that ship and the radar aircraft working overhead, there was nothing else that saw the air over the north at all. What was known up there came through them, and it came in the length of a radio call. Between them, the carriers divided the coast. Each ship held its own stretch, and inside that stretch chose its own targets for the day out of the list it had been handed, all but the ones that could be struck only by special permission. Most of what the aircraft were sent against lay within 30 miles of the water. From the Gulf, it was close work. Men who kept the deck running worked 16 hours a day on average, and the work was heavy and dirty. At night, the aircraft were serviced under dim red light. Rest was difficult while the cycles ran and the ship worked at full rate, and aircrew went out on strikes without having slept enough. That was not an incident. It was the ordinary condition of a ship on the line. Closeness, unbroken noise, and accumulated tiredness were written into the reasoning for taking a ship off station. Not damage, not losses. The plain fact that people could not be held in that space at that rate indefinitely. So a carrier went to port on a schedule of its own, whatever the flying wanted of it, and another took the water it had been holding. That port was Subic Bay in the Philippines. Repair, fuel, ammunition, and by the spring of 1965, 4 times as many ships coming in for them as a year before. General stores came from Yokosuka, 2,000 miles away. Ships ran short of clothing and of aviation oils. Fresh food did not reach everybody aboard. One break in the shipping left Subic itself with 4 days of fuel in hand. One ship left the line and another arrived to take it. The two overlapping by a few days, one sailing on the 8th of May, the relief in place by the 13th. Over the years, the names came and went. Ticonderoga, Coral Sea, Hancock, Enterprise. A change of name meant a different hull, the same water, and the same 20 minutes at the end of the flight, where the Thai Plateau pushes north toward the Mekong and the Lao Shun Panhandle begins. 70 miles is all that separates Thailand from Vietnam. The bases were not there. They stood back to the west, near the capital and the Gulf of Siam, and from those it was 500 miles to Hanoi. A war flown over one country was housed in another, and the housing was the part nobody had prepared. At the start, there were 3 runways in Thailand long enough to take a fully loaded jet fighter without strain. One was the military side of the airport at Bangkok. It had the best buildings in the country, but it was also the civil airport, and the Thai government kept that apron for its own air force, rather than see visible American operations there. That left 2. Tak Lee lay 100 miles north of Bangkok, up the Chao Phraya River. Korat sat on the southwestern edge of its own plateau, about 100 miles northeast of the capital. Into those 2 fields came something near 10,000 American airmen, and more than 100 Thunder Chiefs. 24 electronic warfare aircraft shared the concrete at Tak Lee with them. The 100 miles between the 2 fields decided a great deal. Korat stood close enough to the northern panhandle to fly against it without taking fuel on the way. Tak Lee was further west, and its fighter bombers took fuel every time they went. They also went more often into the delta of the Red River, and losses at Takli ran noticeably higher. 200 miles down the Mekong lay Ubon, which became the main Phantom base in Thailand. From the beginning of 1967, it shared its field with a handful of large radar aircraft, moved up from the south when their old station was wanted for other things. A base that was already crowded gave up part of its buildings to them. Udorn, in the northeast near the river, was not a base anyone struck from. It was where the American Air Command in Thailand sat from 1964 onward, with its operations center and its reporting post. It flew reconnaissance, it kept piston-engined Sky Raiders and the rescue helicopters, and it held one of 2 ground radars watching the north. When the set near Da Nang went off the air, control passed here. Da Nang was the other kind of base, in South Vietnam, on the coast, the northernmost field the Americans had. 200 miles east of Ubon, it could reach the north, Lao Ses, and the south from one runway. It also grew fastest. Air Force strength there rose from 3,300 men to 6,200 in the course of 1966. 2 more fields belong in the list, and neither was a fighter base. Nakhon Pathom stood on the Mekong opposite the Panhandle. It opened with a runway of perforated steel plank, which corroded and had to be relayed in aluminum matting. Propeller aircraft used it regularly. Jets could get in only in an emergency, and many aircraft hit over the north came down there, or held together long enough for a crew to jump where it could be picked up. Utapao was new, 70 miles south of Bangkok on the Gulf of Siam, and its virtue was the water beside it. Fuel could be brought in by sea directly to the base, an arrangement far preferable to trucking it up to the fields in the north. What the northern bases burned came overland, and everything that came overland came slowly. None of this was a settled picture in 1965. That first year, nothing on those bases stood still. Squadrons relieved one another every few weeks through the summer, one arriving on the 12th of June, another 3 days later, a third at the end of the month. Temporary wings were stood up and replaced by permanent ones inside a single season. The structure settled only at the end of the next year. Buildings caught up more slowly than flying did. When Air Force Phantoms first came out in 1965, runways at 2 of the northeastern fields had to be lengthened before they could take them. Across 1965 and 1966, the Thai bases were under attack. 66 the Thai bases were under continuous expansion, and what men lived in there was primitive beside the relative comfort of the later years. Numbers give the shape of it. At the beginning of February 1965, there were about 1,000 Air Force people in Thailand. By the end of June, there were just over 6,000. The aircraft went from 83 to 141 over the same 5 months. Nothing had been built for the difference, and the difference arrived first. What the tropics did to material was a subject of its own. Inflatable shelters, brought in as a quick answer to the shortage of covered space, collapsed when the glue in their seams melted in the heat. The scarcest single item was aircraft tires, chewed through by unpaved taxiway shoulders and by stones blown up onto the concrete. At Takli, goats were turned loose to crop the grass. They became a smelly nuisance and were replaced by lawnmowers. Swimming pools, by contrast, went in early and stayed. They were the more popular because air conditioning for a sleeping room was hard to come by even for aircrew. The bars in the clubs took the edge off a flight and off the boredom of a desk in the same evening. Self-help is the word that appears most often in the reports of the period. Combat units built and improved their own buildings in the middle of a war, because the units meant to do it were months behind. Spare technicians filled sandbags, put up huts, drove buses, and set fence posts. One transport squadron spent its off-duty hours insulating the walls of its own operations building, laying a floor, rewiring it, and fitting air conditioners. When the work was done, the generator failed, and for 2 months they used the improved building without light or ventilation. Commercial power on the local grid ran at 50 cycles and damaged American equipment built for 60. The plumbing in the converted buildings was old French work, and telephones were short enough that several offices spent most of the year on one number. Ammunition ran short in the same years. By April of 1966, commanders were reporting a shortage severe enough to cancel a great many planned strike sorties. By the middle of that year, 13 types of air munition were short, along with parts as small as fuses, and temporary limits were put on how much any one aircraft could carry. The ground was quiet. Thai bases were attacked only a few times in the whole war, all of them by small parties on foot, and the first attack came only in 1968. A year in Southeast Asia was pleasanter spent in Thailand than in South Vietnam. Ground crews stationed there were not eligible for the rest program at all, and they resented it for years. Non-flying men served a year and went home together, and what came in to replace them had usually never seen Southeast Asia. The base taught them at the pace bases teach: concrete, heat, the shade they had put up themselves, and the aircraft going out in the morning over a country nobody on the ground would ever see. The target list came down from Washington, and it came down weekly. What reached the wings was not a list of cities. It was a set of developed targets, worked up by a targeting and intelligence center, and sent out to every strike and reconnaissance unit that would need them. A marshalling yard, a length of rail, a storage area, each one studied by somebody else before anyone was told to fly to it. How many aircraft bombed a target, and what each of them hung under the wings, was decided above the wing. The figure came out of a calculated probability of destruction, worked up from a detailed study of the target itself. A fighter bomber going north carried 7 bombs of 750 pounds, well under what it was able to lift. The rest of the weight was left as maneuver. Clearance sometimes arrived with hours to spare. On one October day in 1967, an airfield was released while the morning force was still on its way home, and the afternoon mission was changed to take it. Loads had to be pulled down and rehung, and the men briefed from the beginning on a target they had never studied. The strike went out that afternoon. Before any of it, somebody went to look at the sky. On days when the North was on the list, a single weather aircraft left 2 or 3 hours ahead of the first strike, flew the perimeter of the heavy defenses in the 6th area, and reported the actual weather to an airborne command post. That report, the ordinary forecast, and the cloud photographs were what a commander launched on. Satellite pictures reached the wings at about 11 in the morning. The first package therefore went out without them, on a forecast and one man's word, and the second went with a photograph of the cloud over its target. Best weather in the northeast monsoon stood between 10 and 3. Both of the day's efforts were fitted inside that window. Night was examined and set aside. Asked about coming in before dawn, the commander at Korat answered that takeoff, join up, and refueling in darkness were workable only in perfect weather. External lights and the camouflage of that period distorted what a pilot saw. and forming up in the dark cost a formation its integrity and its flexibility. Clear sky and some moon were the minimum. The war over the North was flown in daylight. A day was planned as 2 strike packages, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. 16 bombing aircraft in each, and occasionally twice that. Around those 16 went everything else. Fighter escort, the flights that hunted radars, the jamming aircraft, the tankers, an aircraft to control it all and another to photograph the result. 6 aircraft in 10 going north carried bombs. The other 4 did all of the rest. Every flight into the far northeast refueled on the way in. The tankers held long oval orbits called tracks, 9 over Laos, 2 over the Gulf. 4 fighters drank from 1 tanker. Putting a single strike group into the air took about 27 tankers, and it was done twice a day. All of it hung on one time over the target, and every element had to keep it. The requirement gathered the force in one place before it went anywhere. More than 60 aircraft took fuel in the same piece of sky within a few minutes of each other. Most of the targets stood close together, so the force went in on a single common route and shed flights off it as it came. Some targets took the whole package at once. On the Northeastern Railway, a flight of 4 could be given a length of line of its own. Even split, the aircraft stayed close enough to share one fighter screen and the same jammers. Thud Ridge carried them most of the way in, its bulk keeping them off the radars on the approach. It did that only for a while. North Vietnamese radar took the attackers at more than 100 miles out, and jamming, which could hide where a single machine was, made the presence of the group as a whole more obvious. Entry was not one thing. The 2 fighter-bomber wings in Thailand went in differently, and knew that they did. Tak Lee came in low, under the cloud, where a man could see a missile leave the ground with his own eyes, and turn away from it before it had its speed. Korat took the jamming pods, gave up the low approach, and came in high. High entry was flown as a box, a formation tight enough to carry the whole force across the target far faster, so that the gunners had to choose. The box cost accuracy. Only the leader of each flight of 4 could roll easily into the preferred angle of dive. The other 3 began later and came down shallower, which was less accurate and more dangerous. 40 miles from the city, the speed came up from 480 knots to 540. Flight spread toward the outside of the turn that would take them up to bombing height. Just before the run, each machine rolled half over to get a proper look at what it was about to bomb. Bombs came off at around 7,000 feet. The pullout was a few thousand feet above the ground, and coming out of it, a fighter-bomber was often past the speed of sound. Seeing the target was a requirement and not a preference. Directives held that nothing was struck without positive visual identification, and identifying the marshalling yard was not enough. A pilot had to see the assigned part of that yard. Briefings pressed on keeping clear of inhabited places, and the axis of attack was chosen to run away from them. Weather could look acceptable with 30 miles left to run and stand at 7/8 ragged cloud over the target itself. Nothing forecast to change that fast. Whether to go on, to break off, or to go to the alternate belonged to the man leading the strike force. And he had very little time to decide it. Fuel over the target came to 15 or 20 minutes with the afterburner unused. Afterburner improved everything it touched, and it drank at a rate that meant spending it carefully. What was left was the distance home. Nobody gathered the formation while it was still under the defenses. Reforming was not attempted inside 30 miles of the target. Past that, the leader came back on the power and let the others catch up. If a machine was hit, its flight leader turned back to it as a matter of course, and the fighter screen behind detached 4 aircraft to come back with him. Most of the fighters needed fuel again on the way home. On a far target, the whole flight, tanker to tanker, ran 3 hours to 3.5. What the crews had seen went to the debriefing officers, and from them back to the people who worked the targets up. Ground crews needed about 3 hours to rearm a group, service it, and have it ready to fly again. Inside those same 3 hours, the tankers had to be turned round and put back up. Reconnaissance aircraft repositioned, fresh cover moved out over the Gulf. The rescue force replaced if the morning had already spent it, and everyone briefed again on the target changes made while the first group was in the air. The length of a mission with those 3 hours behind it is what held a day to 2 strike efforts instead of 4. By late afternoon, the last of the second package was down, and the tracks over Lauses were empty ovals again. Men who had flown that morning flew the morning after. The same ridge, the same 40 miles, the same 20 minutes in the middle of them, around Hanoi and Haiphong, and along the railways, the roads and the bridges running north and south of both cities. The guns were already standing when the campaign began. Nothing about them was new. One of the automatic weapons in that sky was an American machine gun of 50 caliber, rebuilt by Chinese and North Vietnamese hands for shooting upward. Some of the heavier pieces were older still. Most of the machines that did not come back from the north were taken by those guns, not by the missiles, not by the fighters. The overwhelming majority of them were brought down by barrels, sights, and shells. The oldest weapon over North Vietnam stayed the most dangerous one for the whole of the campaign, and it did so for a plain reason. There was too much of it, and it stood where the aircraft had to be. How much was never settled. American estimates of North Vietnamese anti-aircraft strength varied very widely, and the analysts producing them said so in their own documents. By August of 1966, one count put 4,400 guns in the country, in calibers from 23 millimeters up to 100. Whatever the true figure was, it was rising the whole time anyone was looking at it. The North never tried for command of its own air. It went at something lower and more achievable, denying the sky rather than owning it. And it worked the whole of its air defense as one thing. Missiles were part of that, and so were fighters. The base of it was artillery, and the base held for 3.5 years. Height decided most of it. Of the American aircraft lost to fire from the ground over the north during 1965 and 1966, more than half took their first hit below 4,500 feet. That was also the height at which bombing was accurate. To put bombs where they were meant to go, a fighter bomber had to come inside the working range of the 23 and 37 millimeter guns before it released. What is known about the men behind those guns comes from the other side of the sky. The record is American. Assessments of North Vietnamese gunnery written up in 1965. And nothing from the crews themselves. Gunners were trained to fire at any aircraft within reach, and not to be put off by its speed. Fire cells stayed with one machine until it went out of sight. A trained platoon could put 1,000 rounds into the air at a single fast jet in 3 to 5 seconds. Much of that fire was not aimed at an aircraft at all. Automatic weapons and the heavier 37 and 57 millimeter guns fired barrages on a set bearing and a set height into the volume of sky the aircraft would have to enter. Nothing was following the machine. There was simply somewhere it was better not to be, and the place was already full of metal by the time it arrived. Some of it was arranged in advance. An inviting target would be left standing with a heavy concentration of guns set around it, and the guns would wait. Around 6 in 10 of the medium pieces stood within 30 nautical miles of Hanoi and Haiphong. Others made rings of their own around Vinh, Thai Nguyen, and Yen Bai. Smaller rings. The same idea. New guns appeared faster than they could be counted. The North showed that it could build an 85mm sight with radar control, occupy it, and have it firing inside 6 days. Where to put them was not guesswork either. How often a given target had been hit, and on which days, told the defense where the next attack was likely to go. The heaviest pieces reached higher than anybody flew. A 100mm gun could throw shells to about 39,000 feet, above any profile a strike aircraft used over the North. Coverage was never the difficulty for the defense. Accuracy was, and accuracy was what everything else in the system was for. Against the radars there was a lever. The gun-laying radar the Americans called fire can could be jammed, and the jamming aircraft were at their best doing exactly that. The operators reported breaking its lock again and again, against a barrage on a fixed bearing, and against a man on an optical sight. There was no lever at all. Of 4 aircraft lost in one stretch of 1965, not one went down to radar-directed fire. What worked was going for the guns before the target. A lead flight came in lowest and fastest, from several directions at once, and put cluster munitions across the batteries themselves, including the ones the radar was serving. It also pulled the fire onto itself. The flights behind it arrived at a defense that was busy, and put their bombs closer to where they had been aimed. Flak suppression flights were kept inside the strike package rather than sent out ahead of it. In earlier wars, the suppressors went first. Over the North, the target areas were small, and the defenses around them dense, and what mattered was cutting down the minutes the force spent inside the fire. Those flights went in with a maximum load of cluster munitions. Direction of attack was a choice between 2 bad things. Running west into the afternoon, haze and sun made the target hard to make out. Running the other way kept the aircraft over the most heavily defended ground for longer, and kept it there through the part of the pass where it was slowest to maneuver, and squarely inside the best range of the 37 and 57mm guns. The formations answered with movement. Wingmen flew half a mile to a mile behind their leaders rather than tucked in close. And everybody jinked continuously the whole way through. Against fire put into a volume of sky, movement was what there was. Now and then it went the other way. On a November day in 1965, heavy 37 and 57mm fire damaged one machine over its target, and that same machine put one of the gun positions out of action before it left. Elsewhere, automatic weapons of that same American caliber were found mounted inside an old French fort. Darkness gave no relief. Encounters with guns and automatic weapons after dark grew more frequent, and some of the weapons firing had no gun-laying radar with them at all. Early warning and fighter control posts were passing what they held to the gun units. The guns were shooting on somebody else's picture of the sky. By the end of 1966, the parts were working together. American analysts watching the North's radar net found its coordination so much improved that they began recording what came up against a strike as one organized reaction, rather than 3 separate ones. None of that made the guns better. They were the same weapons, in greater numbers and in more places, and the terms they set never moved. An aircraft that wanted to hit something small had to come down to where they were. 3.5 years of flying north was 3.5 years of accepting those terms, one pass at a time. On the morning of the 24th of July, 1965, 4 fighters were flying escort west of Hanoi, above 20,000 feet. That altitude was considered settled. It was too high for most of the guns, and enemy fighters had hardly been seen at all. Below them, the strike they were covering was on its way to an explosives plant, and the morning was ordinary in every way a man could see from a cockpit. The first sign was words. An aircraft flying with the force to listen to the air passed a code phrase over the radio, and the phrase meant that a guidance radar was working somewhere underneath. Nothing came of it. 5 minutes later, the same phrase came again, and one of the pilots looked out to the right. What he saw was a long white missile with a plume of orange flame behind it, climbing steeply toward the side of the formation. It burst in less than a second. Others were coming up behind it, and men in the other aircraft saw missiles and bursts they could not count. One went off directly beneath the machine opposite. Flame came out of the wing. The aircraft rolled onto its back and went down through the cloud in a spiral. It did not come back, and neither did the 2 men in it. The rest of the formation broke away and came out of the area with holes torn in it. Crews who came home described the thing the same way for the rest of the war. A telegraph pole with fins. It was white, it was very large, and it climbed. For most of the first year, that description was the greater part of what a pilot actually knew about it. None of it arrived unannounced. A high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the first site under construction near Hanoi on the 5th of April, 3.5 months earlier. By the 4th of July, the ring of sites around the city had closed. They were photographed and counted the whole time. They were not struck. A site was easy to recognize from the air, and the interpreters recognized them correctly from the first photographs. The shape was a 6-pointed star, radar vans in the middle, launchers out at the ends of the arms, a revetment for storing missiles, roads coming in. The whole thing was about 750 feet across. The pattern was Soviet. It was built with Soviet technical help, and it was not varied. The day after the first shoot-down, a reconnaissance drone was brought down at 59,000 feet. Nothing that flew over the north flew above the missile. The largest gun the north had reached to about 39,000 feet, and until that July, the top of the sky had been the safe part of it. The answer went out 3 days after the first launch. On the 27th of July, 46, Thunder Chiefs were sent against 2 of the sites with napalm and cluster bombs, and nearly 60 other aircraft went with them to jam, escort, photograph, and refuel. Both of the sites lay out to the west of Hanoi. They came in at 50 to 100 feet above the ground, 4 abreast. Both sites were ringed with guns, and going in and coming out the aircraft were inside heavy fire for 7.5 minutes. 6 of them did not come back. The guidance radars were on the air before the strike, during it, and after it. Photographs taken afterward showed what had been bought. On one site there was a mock missile, put there as bait. The other site was empty, and the losses had not been paid to missiles at all. Almost every machine that went down that day went down to ordinary anti-aircraft guns. Within a week, the whole theater was listening. An order went out that a sortie was to be flown against the missile radars every 3 hours around the clock, the Air Force taking midnight to noon, and the Navy taking noon to midnight. Aircraft that were not carrying bombs were to stay outside the reach of any site believed to have missiles on it. That was not an accident of one morning. There were always more sites than there were missiles and launchers to fill them. A crew could bring the equipment onto a site or take it off again in a few hours, and one site was judged to have been built in 2 days. Strike after strike, the photographs came back showing revetments with nothing in them. The count grew. In the spring of 1965, there was one site. By the middle of 1966, there were more than 100. The system moved south as well, down the roads and the passes, and each move was announced beforehand by a new radar appearing in a district that had never had one. Batteries learned quickly. They fired at night or late in the day, so that darkness would cover the move to another position. They fired from the rear quarter, where the crews would not see the missile coming. A shot from behind was less accurate, and it did not need to be accurate, because a formation that never sees the missile does not break. And a new sight gave nothing to listen to at all, until the moment it fired. Against a missile in the air, the answer was the aircraft itself, and not any piece of equipment in it. The standard break was a half roll and a pull straight down, which the pilots called hitting the deck. Started in time, it worked. Missiles that lost the tracking usually burst above the formation and did little or nothing. One passed between a leader and his wingman, and hurt neither of them. After the first launches, the strike groups went back down. They ran into the target and out again at 500 to 1,500 feet under the missile, in the part of its flight where it was still gathering speed. Against the missile, this worked. Losses to everything else on the ground rose sharply. Then the altitudes crept back up, first to 3,000 and 4,000 feet, and some months later to 6,000 and 9,000. What settled and stayed for the next year and a half was 4,500 feet, and it was chosen as a compromise between the guns underneath and the missile above. By September of that first year, the assessment inside the Air Force was already plain. Most of the aircraft lost over the north had been brought down by fire from the ground below 5,000 feet. And with the middle altitudes closed, the losses low down would go on rising. Crews were told on top of that to keep 30 miles clear of any site that was known. So the sky acquired a floor and a ceiling. Above a certain height there was the missile. Below a certain height there were the guns, and there were thousands of them. Between the two lay a band of air a few thousand feet deep, and for 3 years the strike groups flew the war inside that band. It shifted as both systems changed. It never became wide. The missile did not get better as the campaign went on. It got more numerous, and it was fired more and more often, and hit less and less often. Neither of those things undid what it had already done to the shape of a mission. A break from a missile usually meant getting rid of the bombs, and the flights ran in one behind another a minute or 3 apart, with almost no ability to help one another. Nothing about the work itself changed. The same kinds of target came round on the same list. The same groups took off before light, and the way in was the way of the week before. What had changed was the piece of sky they were given to do it in. It now had something hard at the top and something hard at the bottom, and the distance between the two was not large. The answer to the missile did not begin with a special airplane. It began in the summer of 1965 with ordinary fighter bombers sent down low to find the sites and hit them, flown by men whose equipment for the work was their own eyes. On the 11th of August, the job was given a name, Iron Hand, and taken out of the fortnightly limit on sorties. The first Air Force sortie under that name flew 5 days later. Iron Hand was a task and not a machine, and both services flew it. The Air Force put a few Thunder Chiefs on it. The Pacific Fleet put up attack aircraft of its own. A flight held on the ground at readiness was tried, and did not answer. After that, the anti-missile aircraft went out with the ordinary strikes of the day. In the middle of August, a small group of officers was set to the problem. What came back was the program of the next 3 years, in 4 lines. Fit a few fighters with equipment that could find a working site. Build a missile a fighter could fire at a radar. Build jamming equipment a fighter could carry. And before any of that, give the man in the cockpit something to tell him a radar was looking at him. The last of the 4 came back as a light, a bright red lamp on the panel, which lit when the receivers caught the change in a radar signal that meant a missile had left the rail. That was the whole message. Not a sound, not a picture of anything, a lamp. Range was the one thing nobody had. The equipment could say what kind of radar was working and roughly which way it lay, and the operator could tell the pilot to come right or come left, but neither of them could say how far. Ways of calculating it were tried and given up. The problem followed the crews out of the trials and into the war. 4 aircraft reached Southeast Asia at the end of November 1965, 4 months after the first missile had come up. They were 2-seat versions of an older fighter, the Super Sabre, with the instruments taken out of the back cockpit and receivers put in their place. Formally, they were still a trial. The trial was being finished inside the war, because the warning could not wait. The combat phase ran 60 days. 4 crews flew 112 sorties out of the 135 that had been planned. The first of those went out in company with the big radio reconnaissance aircraft on their ordinary rounds, so that the crews could get used to a sky with several kinds of threat working in it at once. On a strike, the hunters went in front. The strike leader took the group along until the hunter caught a guidance signal, and from that moment the hunter had the lead. It was slower than the aircraft behind it, and they had to weave from side to side to keep from overtaking. The search was flown between 4,500 and 14,000 feet, high enough to hear the radar, low enough that the air was not crowded with everything else. 3 words carried most of a sortie. Contact meant the bearing was good, and it had started. Take it down meant the equipment showed a missile working on the group, and the whole formation went down to break the tracking. That put them into the middle of the guns, and it lost them the bearing they had come for. Tally-ho meant somebody had actually seen the thing on the ground. Seeing it was the difficulty. On the range in Florida, the equipment had brought aircraft over a transmitter to an average of 77 feet. Over the north, that accuracy stopped where the trees began. Sights were put in among trees and beside small villages, and crews flew straight across them without ever seeing anything to attack. In 60 days they saw one. A pilot and the men behind him made out missiles standing under thatched roofs and put 300 rockets into the area. The rest of the time the equipment reported that a sight had passed underneath, and the aircraft pulled up and round in a hard climbing turn to look back at ground it had already crossed. One of the 4 did not come back. On the 20th of December, working a signal about 5 miles from an airfield, the aircraft climbed, turned hard to the right, rolled level and fired its marking rockets. Going out, A 37mm shell went into the afterburner. The flight behind followed it down and watched it go into the cloud. The two men in it did not come back. Against the radar, they built a missile that homed on the radar's own transmission. It was fired from about 10 miles, and the reason was arithmetic. Any further out and the battery could launch, hold its own missile all the way to the aircraft, and switch the radar off before the American one arrived. Crews on the ground learned to watch for that launch and switch off. Then there was nothing left for it to follow. The warhead was small, and so was the damage. Squadrons worked over a site and found the same site on the air again the next day in the same area. Firing the thing cost something too. It had to be lobbed, and the climb to lob it took away speed at the one moment in the sortie when a man wanted speed. What eventually moved the altitudes was a jamming pod. Through 1966, there were never enough of them. By January 1967, there were enough for every strike aircraft, and the run-in altitude went up from 4,500 feet to 15,000. From up there, the target was easier to make out, and losses to the guns fell noticeably. The climb was not uniform. One wing went straight up to the new height inside a season. Another came up a few thousand feet at a time, and did not reach it until the following June. Jamming aircraft stood off along the edge of the prohibited circle, a pair to the northwest and a pair to the southwest, and between them they held open a corridor of interference in toward Hanoi and back out. The pod worked as a formation and not as a box hung under a wing. The jamming of a dozen aircraft overlapped only while they stayed closed up, and a closed formation is not one you fight fighters from. Flights held about half a mile apart and held it. By then the working shape was fixed. A flight came into the target area 20 to 30 minutes ahead of everyone else to stir the radars into transmitting and put them out before the strike arrived. The men who flew it had a name for the country where this took place. They called it the Missile Valley. Every answer on one side produced an answer on the other. The sights went in among the trees. By 1967, the batteries had an order to shut the guidance radar down and blind the American missile on its last mile. Every battalion kept at least 3 alternate positions and left any position it believed had been found. Firing by barrage gave way to single shots and a move, and the last of those changes cost the men on the ground something nobody on the other side had aimed at. While a battery is moving, it is not firing. On the 3rd of April, 1965, 3 fighters of the North came up against a Navy strike group working a target down on the coastal road south of Hanoi. They made one pass and turned for home. Until that afternoon, the air over the North had held nothing but weather and gunfire, and the men who flew into it planned for those 2 things. Now there was a third. The next day, a flight of them came down on Thunder Chiefs, orbiting over the same target, waiting their turn to roll in. The American aircraft were heavy with bombs and slow in the turn. 2 were shot down with cannon fire, and the fighters left at speed. The Americans called them MiGs, and the word went into every briefing after that. What made them dangerous was not the aircraft. It was the ground. Across the north of the country stood a net of search radars paired with height finders, and behind that net a fighter-controlled post carried on a van. The post could see an American formation and could tell the escort from the loaded aircraft, long before anyone in a cockpit saw anything at all. Close control commands reached the pilot in code, and they did not reach him by voice. They were displayed on his ordinary instruments, or as a set of small lamps arranged around the screen of his airborne radar. He did not listen to the ground. He watched it. Flying an interception that way is closer to reading a dial than to talking with anyone. The method was to arrive behind, unseen. A controller lifted the pair, took them into the general area of the target, and worked out the lead, somewhere between 5 and 15 miles, at which the pilot would turn in behind the tail of the formation. The last part of it was flown on eyesight alone. Nothing in the procedure required a long fight. A long fight was never the object. The interceptor was not sent up to shoot the bomber down. It was sent up to make the bomber let go of its bombs early and turn a strike into a jettison 20 miles short of where the bombs were meant to fall. A strike aircraft that drops its load into empty country has done nothing that day. Between September and December of 1966, 107 strike sorties into the northern route packages let their bombs go because fighters came at them. Set against every strike sortie flown in those 4 months, that is a very small share. Set against the aircraft that actually came into contact with the fighters, 192 of them, it is more than half. For most of a year after the summer of 1965, there was almost no fighting at all. The fighters came up, ran the intercept under control from the ground, and broke away before contact. It looked like training, and it probably was. It also worked on its own terms. A run that never became a fight still made loaded aircraft turn and let go. On the 2nd of January, 1967, Colonel Robin Olds, who commanded the fighter wing at Ubon, took up a strike that was not a strike. His fighters flew the profile of a loaded fighter-bomber group. The same tanker tracks, the same refueling altitudes, the same routes in, the same speeds, the same call signs, the same radio traffic. Jamming pods were gathered from every unit that had them, so that each aircraft could carry one. On the screens in the north, it looked like an ordinary day. The interceptors came up for it, and 7 of them were shot down in 12 minutes. How many had taken off that morning is not written down anywhere. On the 6th of January, the same thing was run again, dressed this time as a weather reconnaissance flight. Then the fighter force went back to the ground and stayed there until February. By American reporting, the North had about 70 fighters at the end of 1966 and about 100 at the end of 1967. It was a small force the whole way through, and what it lost was made good. Airfields were struck and craters in the runways were filled in. The American missiles had been designed against bombers that flew straight, against a light fighter that broke hard and downhill. They were often too slow to follow it round. Crews asked for a gun, and in the spring of 1967, the fighters began carrying one in a pod slung underneath. From the end of August 1967, the interceptors worked one pattern. A pair took off and ran south at low level, below and outside the arc. The American radar could see 60 degrees either side of the nose, holding a parallel course until they were a beam of the strike group. It was a long, quiet transit, going the same way as the people it was going to attack. Then the ground told them to climb. In Afterburner, they went up to 25 or 28,000 feet, which put them above the formation and behind it, out to the right. From there, they rolled in and dived on the rear flights. The loaded group below was making 450 to 480 knots. The interceptor came through it well past the speed of sound, missile away, and then either up over the top or straight on through the formation and out the other side. There was no second attempt and no turning fight afterwards. The escort could not accelerate fast enough to answer. From the first sight of it to the end of it was a few seconds, and the aircraft that had been carrying bombs was often no longer carrying them. Against that, the Americans flew under a rule. A target had to be identified by eye before a weapon could be fired. The cost of the rule was written down at the time. Requiring a pilot to see what he is shooting at gives the other man the chance to see him first. In November of 1967, crews reported that the Interceptor was in a perfect firing position before the identification could be completed. So they fired in pairs, one missile behind another in a ripple, because a single one was not worth the hope. A radar missile that lost its hold in a turning fight could take the ground instead and follow it into a hilltop. None of it was quick to do properly. In the spring of 1968, the strikes were pulled back into the narrow southern part of the country, and the Interceptors lost the one thing that made them work. There was no control from the ground down there. A few came south anyway, in radio and radar silence. American sorties over the north rose through that year. Contacts over 9 months of it came to 18. When the strike stopped altogether, the North moved its control equipment down to Vin, as the reporting put it, just in case. By December, there was nothing over Hanoi for the fighters to intercept but American drones. The air war against them ended without settling anything. Neither side had made the other stop. 3 miles north of the town of Tan Hoa, the Song Ma runs between two hills, and a bridge crosses it there. 2 steel trusses, 540 feet from end to end, meeting on a single concrete pier in the middle of the river. It carried the main road south. It also carried the only railway that ran south out of Hanoi. The bridge that stood there before this one was destroyed in the war against the French, and it was the Vietnamese who destroyed it by running 2 locomotives packed with explosive into each other on the span. The replacement took 7 years to build, and it was built to be hard to take down. It was finished in 1964. They called it the Dragon's Jaw. It was on the American target list before the first strike of the campaign. The railway and the road ran roughly 150 miles from Hanoi down to Vin, and the planners cut each of them into 2 stretches. What cut them was this bridge. Small bridges were counted inside a stretch. This one was a target of its own. On the 3rd of April, 1965, 79 aircraft went against it. 46 of them were Thunder Chiefs carrying the bombs. The rest worked the guns, watched for fighters, flew the weather, took the photographs, and carried the fuel. It was a full day's work by the standards of that spring, aimed at one object standing in one river, about 70 miles south of Hanoi. 254 750-pound bombs went onto it, and 266 rockets. The spans did not fall. Across the first 2 days, the bridge was worked 3 times in all, the last of them by 48 strike aircraft with 384 bombs. One span sagged, and traffic across it stopped. Then traffic started again. The man who planned that first strike and led it was Lieutenant Colonel Robinson Reisner. Gunfire holed his aircraft on the run and filled the cockpit with smoke, and he stayed over the target directing the others until they were finished, then flew down to Da Nang and landed there. He led the bridge again the following day. In May, he was given the first Air Force Cross of the war. A third attempt came on the 7th of May, against defenses that had thickened since April. 64 aircraft went in. 28 of them carried bombs, and they laid 356 of them along the bridge and the ground around it. The eastern approach and the rail bed were torn up, and the eastern end of the truss was damaged. Both spans stood. Afterwards, the results were taken apart, and the answer came back in 3 pieces. The 750-pound bomb broke into fragments and barely penetrated structure, so most of what had been dropped had been spent on air. Crews and staffs did not know their fuses well, and when a large group worked one small target at the same time, the aiming got worse rather than better. The circular error ran out to 700 feet. 700 feet was also where the misses were sitting, a scatter of craters short of the approach. The concrete abutment at the end of the bridge looked 30 or 40 feet thick. To break that with bombs of that weight, at that accuracy, would take a quantity of bombs nobody was going to be able to deliver. The advice that came out of it was about craft, not weight. Stop sending large formations at it. Go in 4s and 6s at odd hours. Hit and leave. Aim between the middle of the bridge and its eastern end, so as to cut the beams instead of battering the abutment. And do not go back at all until a missile with a 1,000-pound warhead arrives. The rest of the list was not like this. Of the major bridges in the southern half of the country that had been struck by the beginning of June, everyone had had at least one span brought down. Everyone except this bridge. That held to the end of the year, and by then it had been reported seriously damaged again and again. At the end of July, a flight tried 3,000-pound bombs on it, the first time those had been used in this war. The span stayed up, and the people crossing on foot stopped crossing for a while. Late in the year, the Navy went at it 4 separate times with bombs laid by radar. The bombs fell beside the bridge and its approaches, and no clear assessment came back at all. In the spring of 1966, somebody proposed going at it from the water. 5 charges of 5,000 pounds would be rolled out of the back of a transport into the river a mile above the bridge, and would drift down on the current and fire when they touched the structure. The charges were built in Florida and dropped about 80 times in practice. 2 crews were trained on 2 aircraft, and both arrived at Da Nang in the middle of May. Weather held them until the end of the month. Just after midnight, the first of the 2 went out from Da Nang, around over the Gulf, and came in along the river. 10 miles to the north, a flight of fighters made a loud diversion, and jamming aircraft blinded the radars around the bridge. The run itself was flown at about 150 knots, 400 feet above the water, through the guns. 5 charges went into the river. The crew had done everything they were trained to do. The photographs the next morning showed no new damage to the bridge, and no sign of the charges anywhere. The following night, the same mission was flown again. 2nd crew, 2nd aircraft, nothing altered in the procedure. One of the navigators from the first night went with them. That aircraft and its crew did not come back. Behind the bridge stood a system of repair that worked in the dark. An observer who traveled those roads described coming up to a bombed stretch at night and finding it already passable. Several hundred women filling the craters with stone and gravel, gathered somehow out of the country around, working where nothing could be clearly seen. Almost every main road in the country, he wrote, was in a state of permanent running repair. Bridges that had gone down were replaced with pontoons made of bamboo rafts, and often a pontoon crossing was alternated with a ferry, so that the photographs would never settle into a pattern. When daylight came, one end of a floating bridge was cast off, and the whole structure swung round on the current and lay along the bank. From the air there was a river with nothing across it. Other crossings were laid a foot or less under the surface of the water, which from an aircraft at 400 knots is not a thing the eye finds. Beside a damaged bridge, there might be a spare span lying ready in the grass, so that a structure photographed as destroyed needed only to be lifted back into place. By 1967, the Navy had a bomb a man could steer by television, and it was used against the harder bridges because it let the aircraft turn away early. It weighed 1,100 pounds. Direct hits with it did not bring the span down. Across the 3 years of the campaign, hundreds of sorties went against this bridge, and 11 aircraft were lost against it. Television bombs, radio-guided missiles, 3,000-pound bombs, mines floated down the river. It stood. No span ever dropped, and nothing done to it ever kept it out of use for long. The strike groups came back to it, and in between they went on to other things. In the nose of the reconnaissance aircraft there was a camera where the gun would have been. The Voodoo carried nothing to drop and nothing to fire with, and it was the mainstay of the photographic effort through 1965 and 1966. It flew out of Tan Son Nhut and later out of Udorn in Thailand. A flight that went well ended in film. Height was the whole of the problem. The pilot had to be high enough for the camera to take in a wide strip of ground, and low enough for the picture to be worth reading. The compromise was 2,000 feet. Even there, the definition was not sharp enough to make out single gun positions, soldiers, trucks, or small boats. An unarmed aircraft went in alone or in pairs. The permission granted at the end of March 1965 was counted that way. No more than 10 two-plane flights in a week. Better cameras wanted lower flying, and lower flying is where the guns are. One of these aircraft was hit in late January 1966 and did not come back. Something was tried in the April of that first year. 3 of them were fitted in haste with jamming pods, taken off bases in Japan and on Okinawa. The pods had not been built for vibration in flight. Parts worked loose inside them, and the wingtips of the aircraft began to curl. The pods came off again and went home. Weather took its share before anything else did. An estimate made before the low flying was allowed said that April cloud over the north would likely make between 40 and 60 of every 100 mid-altitude reconnaissance flights useless. A new machine arrived at the end of October 1965, built to work in weather and at night. 9 of them flew out from South Carolina and landed at Tan Son Nhut. The first flight over Laos came in the middle of November, and the first over the north the day after. By the end of the year, it had made 6 flights over the north. What it carried mattered more than what it looked like. Infrared equipment, radar looking sideways and radar looking ahead, cameras for day and cameras for night, an exact navigation set, and the fittings to take on fuel in the air. It also developed its own film while flying, and threw the cassette out, so that the pictures reached commanders in the field sooner. Every improvement pointed the same way, which was down. The infrared set needed low altitude to give any resolution, and the radar that looked straight down proved more useful than the one that looked to the side. The older aircraft carried the work through 2 years. The new one took the greater part of it only in 1967. Ahead of a strike went a weather scout to say what the sky over the target was doing. In the daily allocation, 5 aircraft out of Tan Son Nhut were written down for weather reconnaissance, for leading others in, and for looking at what a strike had done. It was part of the order of the day rather than an event in it. The film went to 2 places. By the end of 1961, there were 2 processing units, 45 people in each, one at Tan Son Nhut and one at the airport outside Bangkok. They developed and read what the aircraft brought back, briefed pilots on their targets, and wrote up what the film showed of the other side. Part of the laboratory was pushed into a building that was falling down, and the rest was spread over trailers and sheds. Power came and went. Air conditioning ran at half strength most of the year, and in the hottest months, not at all. Automatic processing gear stood at 130 degrees in high humidity and broke constantly. Emulsion slid off the film in that heat, and the people working there slowed down with it. Technicians hung ice wrapped in plastic in the chemical baths to bring the developer down to the temperature it wanted. At the end of every flight over the north, there was, somewhere in the chain, a block of ice in a tank. Film was measured in miles. By January 1966, one laboratory was handling 3 million feet of it a month, 7 times what it had handled a year before, while the number of people who could read a picture had only doubled. The squadron borrowed 22 men from another headquarters. Hands went to developing, reading, and quality control got what was left. The work had 3 parts, and the volume broke the last 2 of them. Collection, interpretation, dissemination, strong at the first and weak at the other 2, with the sheer quantity of film overwhelming the equipment, the buildings, and the people. In the first half of 1966, the infrared flights were halved to 38 a month, and the day photography doubled to 75. What an interpreter was looking for was mostly small and mostly deliberate. At a broken crossing, a floating span was brought up in the dark. Traffic went over it all night, and before first light it was towed aside and laid along the bank. Finding those spans and the heavy cranes that moved them was the serious part of the job. Other things showed as marks rather than as objects. A dark smudge beside a fork in the road was a road grader, and within days of a strike, the photograph showed a bypass going in around the damage. From August 1965, the low-flying was allowed for one purpose above all others, which was to confirm where the missile sites were. At the end of March 1966, the cameras found about 53 aircraft crates standing on one airfield. 30 of them were thought to hold fuselages, and 23 to hold wings. The staff estimate was that flyable aircraft could be put together out of them in about 6 weeks. All of that came from reading a photograph. By the middle of 1967, the fighters were carrying cameras of their own to record what their own bombs had done, and those pictures were never as good as the ones the reconnaissance aircraft brought home. An interpreter who found a probable missile site on a photograph gave the reason for sending a flight of bombers to it. Infrared looked for warmth instead of shape. It searched out the fires that gave a place away. Bivouac fires, cooking fires, sentry fires, small workshops, and the heat that came up through camouflage. Most of that particular flying was done in the south. One picture from those years shows gun crews running for their guns, caught in the open by an aircraft that had come over without warning. Fighters made passes at these aircraft and threatened them. In the April of 1966, 2 of them broke away near Yenbai and came home. The end of a flight was a man on a ladder. When the pilot climbed out, the ground crew took the film off the aircraft, and the cassettes went across to the sheds and the trailers, into the tanks with the ice in them. What the flight had found was not yet known. It would be known when somebody had read it. The parking apron was aluminum planking laid over sand. Rainwater gathered under the plates and washed the sand out from beneath them, so that the surface came up in pits and ridges, and repair teams were forever changing sections of it. Room on it was barely enough for the aircraft standing there. Everything was towed and taxied with great care. Engines were run at the lowest power that would do the work. At anything more, panels and covers and whatever else was not tied down went away across the apron. While one aircraft had an engine turning, work on the aircraft beside it stopped because of the blast. At Da Nang, every working building stood hard against the two parallel runways and the taxiways beside them. Aircraft taxied and took off around the clock, and the noise cut through work, meetings, and conversation without stopping. A squadron's operations building was one large room and two small offices. Inside it were the armament store, the air-to-ground radio, the planning and operations sections, the store for aircrew equipment, the records, and in a corner, the bed where the duty officers slept. On a newer field, the maintenance shops were tents. No hangar, no run-up pad, no test stand, no place to repair a fuel cell, no wash rack. There was a parachute tower and no dryers to hang the canopies in. Summer rain put 6 inches of mud around the shops. Dust, noise, and heat were the three constants, and between them they made simple work slow. Dust off the construction machinery settled on everything, from typewriters to fine electrical gear. Parts were short in the same chronic way. Brakes, tires, wheels, windscreens, starters. Of the aircraft not flying, 3/4 were down for maintenance and the rest for want of a part. Across the whole strike force in Southeast Asia, 75 of every 100 aircraft stayed in commission, which was above the 71 the Air Force held as its standard. Inside that average, the spread was wide, close to 90 for some types, and 51 for the heavy fighters through September and October. The plan written at deployment gave every aircraft rather more than one flight a day, and no type managed it. A machine went up about once in a day, and the heaviest of them less often, and crews flew almost every mission they were given. How much of that fell on any one man depended on his squadron. One had 60 officers to 18 aircraft, and its crews flew every other day at the most, and usually 1 day in 5. Another had a single crew to each aircraft, and those crews flew nearly every day. For each man who went up, hundreds stayed on the ground, and many of those units worked 7 days a week around the clock with the same number of people. A 40-hour week was given at home. Mail for a base of some 3,000 men was handled by 6 people. The base grew past 5,000 and the 6 were not added to. They also ran the message center, and the whole operational day of the wing went through it, and through them, 7 days a week for as long as they were there. Drinking water was made at one point on the base and driven out from there, 50,000 gallons a day to 75 places. Rubber bladders holding 5,000 gallons stood beside the mess halls and the clubs to cut down the number of tanker runs. The local water system on that base ran 4 hours out of the 24. Water to the showers was shut off for 4 hours a day, and the laundry was allowed 2 basins to a wash. A barracks was lit by 8 bulbs of 100 watts. There was no hot water to shave in, and one heater served 40 men if they were quick about it. In the newer 2-story barracks, men slept in bunks in open bays, with one locker between 2 of them. Some squadrons flew around the clock, so movement through the building never stopped, and men who worked at night found sleep hard to come by. Changing clothes was awkward. Writing a letter was awkward. Roofing slate was short. So many crews slept in rooms that were hot and damp and had no air conditioning. Complaints ran to rats and mice in the lockers, along the rafters, up onto the bunks of sleeping men, out and about in daylight. A standard hut was screened all round and roofed with slate, 16 feet by 32, and it held 7 officers, or 20 enlisted men. One unit on another base had a 3-room trailer with air conditioning in it for aircrew to sleep in, and the nearest latrine was 500 yards away. What a man got depended on which base he had been sent to, and on what had been finished when he arrived. The command that took over in the spring set about the look of the bases, housing plans, tighter dress and discipline, buildings scrubbed out, and flowers along the main streets and around the headquarters and the barracks. A man's tour was 1 year. 5 days of it could be spent with his family, at government expense, in Honolulu or Tokyo or Bangkok. The weather did not have to be bad to stop a day. It had to be bad over one particular piece of ground, and that ground was small. A plan made up the night before came apart in the morning, and what went out instead was settled by men weighing what a target was worth against the fuel on hand and against how quickly a machine could be turned round and put back into the air. Waiting was not idleness. Aircraft came apart on the stands and went back together. Crews were briefed on ground that stayed under cloud for another week, and the boards were made up again for a day that was not flown. Then the sky opened somewhere, and what had been prepared for one place went to another. The season decided how much of any of it was ever flown. Out on the water, the ships kept their own count. A carrier left its station to take on stores and be relieved, and in time came back to it. The measure of a stay that the record gives is 37 days on station without a break. Repair meant a dock at another base, in another country. On the schedule board, the month had a name. What the day would be was settled by the cloud sitting over the delta. And it was settled again the next morning and the morning after that. The aircraft stood out on the planking under their covers. Somewhere along the line an engine was turning, and the work on either side of it had stopped. At Udorn, the rescue crews got up at 3:30 in the morning. Breakfast in one of the clubs, a van out to the ramp, helmets drawn, survival gear checked, signatures against pistols and rifles, weather, then the mission, then intelligence. By first light they were airborne and going north. Forward strips were nothing much from the air, and no better from the ground. A dirt runway on a hilltop in Lausas, huts banked with sandbags, trenches. Crews slept in the helicopter or under it. In the busy hours they climbed to an orbit at 10,000 feet, on station before the first bomber ran in. What started everything was a small radio. Each pilot carried a survival pack in his seat, and the set inside had 2 modes, voice and a beeper that laid a broken tone across the frequency. Often the beeper was how the men circling above learned somebody was alive. And sometimes the tone worked when the voice never did. First over the place, more often than not, was a forward air controller in a small aeroplane. He had been working that ground already, and he was on-scene commander until the rescue aircraft came. Then 4 propeller-driven escorts arrived in 2 pairs, one high and one low. Their call sign was Sandy. The leader of the low pair took the picture from there. He worked out where exactly the man was, where the gun stood, whether to put them down himself or call for strike aircraft. And it was he who gave the helicopter permission to come in. One way of learning what was below was to fly across the area low, over and over, drawing fire on purpose. In one case that meant 40 passes in 2 hours, and only after 2 more hours of silence did the helicopter go down. Above all of it, a large four-engined aeroplane held station under the call sign, Crown, later King. It stayed up for hours, heard everyone at once, and passed it down to the control centers. An analysis put a number on what the crews knew. 47% of failed attempts were explained by the slowness of the helicopters. Inside 15 minutes, a man's chances were good. Past 30, they fell away fast. From the northernmost forward site to Hanoi was 150 nautical miles, 300 knots to arrive in half an hour, 600 to arrive in 15. Nothing with a rotor could. So the odds were never one number. They turned on where a man came down and how long it took to reach him. After dark, the attempts were rare, and almost all of them failed. For the first stretch, there was very little to send. At the end of 1964, the whole theater held 13 small helicopters of the kind kept beside a runway for crashes and fires, with a combat radius of 75 nautical miles. There was no room in one of them for a gunner. By the middle of the next year, there were about 24 of the same, a pair of borrowed cargo helicopters, a few amphibians that could land on the sea, and 2 command aircraft. The cargo machines came painted green and brown, and the paint gave the whole business its name. At the end of that year, 6 aircraft arrived that had been built for the work rather than adapted to it. A ton of armor, a ceiling of 12,000 feet, a hull that could sit down on water, and a hoist with 240 feet of cable. On the end of the cable hung a weighted shape with spring-loaded arms that pushed the leaves aside, going down and folded out at the bottom into a seat. On the 1st of January 1967, there were 50 rescue aircraft and helicopters in the theater. At the end of that year, a machine came in nearly twice the size of the one before it. Hovering over a clearing, it was still an easy thing to shoot at. The other half of the answer was fuel. On the 17th of December 1965, over the sea off the Carolina coast, a crew flew a helicopter into the wake of a 4-engine tanker and put a probe into the drogue. Nothing was pumped. The idea came from a helicopter pilot who had argued that a boat-shaped hull could ride the wash of 4 propellers like a boat on water. Fuel crossed for the first time a year later, in December of 1966. On the 21st of June 1967, it was used in Southeast Asia, and by September it was ordinary. Time on the orbit had been 2 hours, 2.5 at the outside. Now it doubled. Fuel could also be dumped to lighten a machine for a hover in the mountains and taken back on the way home. Every mission into the far north went out with a tanker and met one again coming back, 5,000 pounds for the last leg home. Tankers over the Gulf of Tonkin also went north, past the line they had been given, when a fighter called to say he was low and would not make it. There is one span of years for which the count exists. Across the 3 years ending with 1966, the rescue forces saved 647 lives, and 222 of those were aircrew taken out of combat. Out of North Vietnam itself, the number was small, a few dozen men, counted service by service, and out of the water in the Gulf, a few dozen more. After those years, the volume stopped giving a figure at all. Not everyone was reached. Some came down where nobody could get to them in time, and they did not come back. The next morning began at 3:30 like the one before it. On the 23rd of June 1965, a fighter bomber was hit by gunfire over the southwest of North Vietnam. The pilot could not drag it across the ridge and went out. The parachute did its work properly and it put him into a tree, hanging upside down in the harness 150 feet above the ground. He swung himself until he could reach the trunk, got into a fork of it, and worked out of the harness. Then he took his knife, cut a branch, and used the branch to pull the survival pack into himself. Out of the pack came the radio. Half an hour later, 4 escorts were over the forest. They found the canopy in the branches, passed the position up, and drew off to an orbit several miles away, so that nothing circling would show where he was. An hour and a half after he had left the aircraft, the helicopter came in. He fired the small flare. The crew saw it, brought the machine straight over him, and the para-rescuemen lowered the hoist down through the leaves. A few hours later, he was in the officers' club, buying drinks for the men who had flown it. The next day, he went back to his own base. The first mission went out on the 2nd of March, 1965. The target was a storage depot about 10 miles north of the demilitarized zone. Some 35 acres of ground and 49 buildings on it, barracks and offices and sheds. It was the 5th Rolling Thunder program. The first 4 had been drawn up and never flown. 25 Thunder Chiefs and 20 bombers carried the load. 16 aircraft and 8 others went against the guns. More flew fighter escort and rescue patrol. 2 went for photographs, and 6 were tankers. The bombs were of 250 and 500 pounds. No enemy fighters came up. Later that month, on the 19th of March, armed reconnaissance was authorized. Strikes against whatever could be found along a stretch of road or railway, rather than against a place named in advance. The first phase closed on the 11th of May, and everything flown in it had been flown in the southern part of the country. It ran for 3 years, and it did not run continuously. Work stopped and started again on a calendar of its own. The first stop fell in the middle of May 1965 and lasted less than a week, and the sorties that would have gone north were flown inside South Vietnam instead. Last sorties of 1965 were flown on Christmas Eve. At 6 that evening, a truce of 30 hours was announced. Midnight of the 25th went by with nothing flown against the north, and the truce ran on into the 26th. On the 27th, commanders were told to be ready to resume at short notice. And before that day was out, the stop had been extended. It was extended after that, and again, and flying north was not authorized until the last day of January. The stops that followed were shorter. Christmas of 1966 and the New Year took 48 hours each. In February of 1967, the stop for Tet began as 4 days and ran to 6. In January of 1968, there was a stand down of 36 hours. At Tet that year came 48, and behind it another 36. Each time the aircraft stayed on the ground for a set number of hours. Each time they went back afterwards to the same work in the same places. On the 31st of March 1968, the strikes north of the 20th parallel stopped. Not long after, the line came down to the 19th, and nothing was flown north of it for the rest of the campaign. What was left to work over was a narrow band of country in the south. That same quarter, the weather took its own share. In the first 3 months of 1968, there were 14,678 strike sorties, against 21,983 in the quarter before. February gave the worst conditions of the 3 years. Nearly everything had to be dropped through cloud on radar, and nothing of the result could be seen from above. In the first week of July 1968, there was a short operation of another shape. Aircraft. naval guns and field artillery firing together for a week against artillery positions in a coastal sector just north of the demilitarized zone. It was small, and it counted formally as part of the campaign. Across the whole of that year, the Air Force flew 43,976 combat sorties over North Vietnam. The last effort began in the middle of July, planned to run 30 days, and was extended until the 31st of October. What the year was credited with was counted item by item, by American reckoning, in the way such things are counted. 1,374 trucks destroyed, 6,452 cuts and slides in the roads, 955 buildings, 136 bridges, 1,033 boats. Losses were counted against sorties flown in the summer of 1966 over the route package that covered most of the Red River Delta. The Air Force loss rate passed 25 strike aircraft for every 1,000 strike sorties. Before the work over the Delta began, losses had rarely gone above 3 in 1,000 anywhere in Southeast Asia. On the 31st of October 1968, it was announced that this was ending. It ended the following day at 9 in the evening. Between the announcement and the hour, 346 strike sorties were flown by the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. That is what the end looked like. Not a last mission with anything about it to mark it, but an ordinary full day of work with nothing behind it. Aircraft were briefed and loaded and flown, and recovered and turned round, and the turnaround led nowhere. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the whole thing was off, and the schedule that had governed every morning of it stopped governing anything. For the campaign as a whole, one pair of figures is given. About 1 million sorties were flown by the Air Force together with the aviation of the Navy, the Marines, and South Vietnam. More than 750,000 tons of bombs were dropped. For what it cost, one more pair. By October of 1968, 990 aircraft had been lost, and more than 800 men of the flight crews did not come back. The campaign is judged in opposite directions. A summary report written in that same year says that it was meeting its military objectives. A study written later says that it did not achieve its main objectives. Both were written by American military historians. Both stand in the official volumes, a few shelves apart, and neither of them settles the other. One thing was recorded straight away, with no judgment attached to it. In the days after the stop, Reconnaissance showed heavy military traffic moving on all the main coastal routes toward the demilitarized zone, and the small harbors along the coast crowded with boats shifting cargo. The work itself moved rather than ended. Wings that had been going to Hanoi and Haiphong now bombed the supply lines west of the Annamite Range, in Lao SS, where the weather was good. Reconnaissance over the north did not stop either, and neither did the flying against the routes. It went on along the same service lines as before. The Air Force over its own route package, and the Navy over its own. Very few changes in the manner of operations were needed. A belt 10 miles wide was drawn along the border of the north, and any aircraft with business inside it flew under positive control. North of the 18th parallel, an early warning radar aircraft handled it. South of that, a ground system or a forward air controller. Everything else stayed where it was, and every unit stayed ready in case it began again. The quiet that came after the 1st of November was not silence. It was a change of scale, and the scale can be put in two numbers that sit oddly next to one another. In the busiest year of it, More than 100,000 strike sorties were flown over the north, and almost as many again went along with them to escort, to photograph, and to refuel. The year after our story ends, the same country was overflown about 5,000 times by reconnaissance aircraft, with 15,000 fighter sorties out in front of them and alongside them. That second set of numbers is the shape of what remained, not nothing. Fewer airplanes doing narrower work, with most of the effort spent protecting the few that were doing it. The first reconnaissance aircraft that went north after the stop went alone, without escort. 14 of those flights crossed the narrow part of the country in 4 days, and nothing at all happened on any of them. Then one was fired on at night, off the coast, and after that the escorts were put back, and the firing went on anyway. Later in the month, an aircraft photographing a missile site at about 3,000 feet was hit and did not come back, and 2 days after that an escort came down as well. So the work continued. It was called something else, and it was smaller, and the men doing it were doing it over ground that no longer had a campaign attached to it. Nobody stood anything down, because nobody could say that it was over. One part of it grew. The forces that existed to go back after people who had come down did not shrink when the bombing stopped. By the summer of the following year, there were 71 aircraft and helicopters in 4 squadrons doing that work, and it stayed at about that level for another year after that. Of everything in this story, that was the only line that was larger at the end than it had been in the middle. The rest of it can be described without any judgment at all, because that is how it was recorded at the time. A day's work was got ready before light, flown, brought back, and got ready again. That was the whole of it. And the day after it was the same, and the day after that. Across 4 calendars of that, a great many things were destroyed and a great many of them were rebuilt. Usually at night, usually by people with hand tools and baskets, and the road stayed open, and the country underneath it is still there. And it has not changed in any of the ways that would have mattered. The coast still runs 700 miles north from the middle of the country, almost to China, a narrow strip of flat ground with the sea on one side and the hills close on the other. The road along the strip and the railway beside the road. The Red River still comes down out of the northwest and lays out its delta, and the dikes still hold the water where the rice needs it, as they have for a very long time. The high ground west of the coast still stands 8,000 feet in places, and the forest still closes over it, and there are still valleys in the limestone too narrow for a large aircraft to turn around in. The weather still arrives from the northeast at the end of every year and puts a lid of low cloud over all of it for months, and lifts in the spring and comes back. It did that while the aircraft were going north. It did it before them. It does it now on a schedule of its own that nobody set and nobody could suspend. The numbered boxes are gone. They were never on the ground in the first place. They were lines agreed between headquarters, drawn on a chart so that 2 air forces would not fly into the same piece of sky at the same time. When the campaign stopped, the boxes stopped with it, and the sky went back to being sky. What the men who worked there did was fly a route and come back and fly it again. It was not the kind of work that finishes. It could only be continued or stopped. In the end, it was stopped at 9 o'clock in the evening, after an ordinary full day of flying, and the men who had flown that day went to bed not knowing whether they would be going north in the morning. Sleep well,